Roland, I'd like to talk with you a little bit about the spiritual life and the world of art, which I think go together. People often talk about the religious dimension of life and also the aesthetic dimension, and they're very, very closely intertwined, I think. And so I do that. I think of you as someone who is really not only interested in the arts, but has some skill with them and has had the opportunity to study and read about all of that, which sets up a question in my mind. It's sort of like the elitist question versus the common or popular culture. I mean, I know you like to go to opera, sure, and that you have a feel for the fine arts in life, and you can talk about it and so on. And I'm thinking there's other people who really aren't into it that much. I mean, they may not want to go to the opera, and they don't visit the museum and so on. And yet I think there's a way in which all of us are called to develop the aesthetic dimension of our lives, in which we have to have some sense of beauty, and in which maybe even if we don't have the words for it, we still have some sense of what we like and what we appreciate, what nourishes our spirit and so on. But that is a little bit of a tension between what we might think of as an elitist world of art as more in contradistinction to a more popular form.
Well, I think it is. If you go back to the time of Aristotle and thinkers like that, and actually through the centuries for a good part of the time, the arts was a phrase that was used with a much broader kind of meaning. It's really been only in the last couple of centuries that it's narrowed down to specifically, painting, music, and that kind of thing. Art used to have the meaning of simply anything that was well done. So you could be an artistic ditch digger if you really did that work with care and you put your heart into it. Ordinary things became artistic. Writing a letter could be a work of art. And I know in our own time that Matthew Fox, the Dominican priest who teaches creation spirituality, makes a big point of that we should be careful not to speak just of the elitist arts, because not everybody is a poet, not everybody is a painter, and so on. But we are letter writers. We bake a cake, or we have a garden, or whatever. And so you can have art in that broader sense, of doing anything with commitment and with passion and with love, and then it becomes artistic.
Yes, I think Jacques Maritain in his famous book Art and Scholasticism talks about that as art as a sort of practical habit in which people are able to create or to make things.
Yeah.
And that is a skill that people have in many different ways. I mean, some people are artistic in the kitchen and pride themselves on that. And the way they present the food and so on. And other people would have the garden, for example, or their lawn.
Yeah.
Maybe their lawn represents their idea of beauty, and it's important to them, or the way the house looks. There would be all kind of ways in which I think that happens for people. So that, in other words, what I'm thinking of at the beginning, if it's true that art is supposed to help the spiritual life, it is not simply in terms of people who like to go to the opera. There are many other ways in which our spiritual life can be nourished by encounters with the world of art.
Oh, absolutely. I find that because I grew up in a musical home and I really got to love the opera quite early, that for me it is probably the summit of art, in the sense that the opera has everything in it. It has singing, it has orchestral music, it has dancing, it has acting, and so on. But that doesn't mean everybody has to like the same thing. I mean, each person comes at the business of living with their own personality and their own likes and dislikes. And I have very Catholic tastes, really, with small c. I love Joan Baez. I love many of the popular performers. I'm crazy about some of the musical shows. The Toledo Rep just did Man of La Mancha, and a wonderful production in June. And it was thrilling to watch that, and I think profoundly spiritual, too. Of course, that, I think, is one of the greatest musicals ever written. And when it's done that well, it's wonderful to see. There really is a tremendous number of ways of being artistic. And I don't want to try to be elitist and say everybody has to be one way.
Right. And so once we draw everybody in, then we really can look at this question of saying how the encounter with the world of art or the aesthetic experience enables us to grow in the spiritual life. I'd just like to see it as sort of a antidote to a lot of the subjectivism that we have in our world today. We live in a culture that prides individualism, and we like to think that everybody can think for themselves and have their own experience. We have a famous Latin phrase, de gustibus non est disputandum, which means about taste there is no dispute. In other words, everyone has their own artistic taste, is the sort of way it goes, and it gives a very subjective feel to the way we encounter art. I mean, you like this painting, I like this one, I can't stand that film, you love it, and so on. And so there's a sort of sense that, well, everybody's got their own way of coming at this. And I think when you talk like that, it simply reinforces something in our culture that really isn't all that healthy, an excessive subjectivism that forgets the role of the objective world, the community sense of things, and the fact that there are standards and ways to make judgments about what is really true and false, about what is really beautiful or ugly.
Sure. For about 14 years, I taught film study at the high school and college and adult ed levels. And one of the things I did with any class that met for at least a semester was to give them a sheet of paper at the end listing all the films that we had watched. And then I'd ask the students to pick the film that they loved the most and then briefly express why, and then the film that they hated the most and briefly to express why. And I remember in Jackson, Michigan, where I taught, that I had 5 sections. So I had about 250 students, and I put all of their answers, I remember, together, and dittoed them and handed them out. And every year the same thing happened. The same films brought the strongest reactions, and there would always be people who hated the same film and who loved it. And it was actually illuminating, I think, to a lot of them to hear that this work of art that I reacted to so positively, somebody else loathed, and to hear the differences of opinion. And it didn't matter to me too much what they liked or didn't like, but to understand what it was in them as much as I could that brought that reaction, and then to respect other people when they had different reactions.
I guess one of the things that we're seeing today when we talk about the world of art is a reminder that it makes an impact on us. To encounter a classic work, or really any work of art, is to be drawn out of ourselves. It's not merely a subjective experience, like you go to look at this painting and I go, and that there's no impact of the work itself. You got your feeling, I got mine. I think that isn't true. What is happening is the work of art is triggering something inside of us. We are resonating with it in some way, but we don't just make that up. It doesn't come from the sky. It's involved in whatever the artist has put into the work of art. I would guess that some of the films that people responded to in your classes most strongly were probably some of the finer films.
Oh, yes.
And that they were the ones that maybe had high artistic quality and were able to touch people at a deeper level. That's why you got people loving it and hating it. That would be my guess anyway.
Oh, I would think so. Yeah, and then if the person can somehow figure out what is it in their personality and their psyche that brought about that strong reaction, what was it they loved, and what did they learn about themselves from that experience, and conversely, why did they hate it? And through the art, then you can come to know who you are. And I think that's really one of the outstanding functions of the artist, to help us to know ourselves more deeply, to know what it is to be human, and in connection with this whole spirituality theme, also to connect with God and to connect with the world, and really to know who we are more deeply.
And I guess the way one would go about that is to, as you suggested, is to see what resonates with us and why we respond in a certain way to a work of art. But when we're doing that, there's something that the artist has disclosed about the world that's causing us to respond in this way. That's a good word, I think, to talk about what art does. That is, it has a disclosive power. It discloses to us what is there. And of course, from a spiritual viewpoint, what we think is being disclosed is really the presence of the great God, because God is the source of all the beauty and we find in the world. God is the source of reality as a whole. So if you get beneath the surface of things, or if the finite encounter with the world of art really is working properly, it's pointing us to something more. It's disclosing the very structures of reality, or the source of the reality that we know, again, the one that we call our God.
Yeah, it's a window into infinity in a way that it gives us some hint of the eternal beauty. which we can only know in a human way by what we see and what we perceive with our senses here on earth. So when the artist gives us an experience of that beauty, which is exhilarating and which makes life wonderful, it is ultimately an experience of God, or at least pointing toward that, I think.
Now, the artistic experience over the years has differed a little bit. I guess through the early years, if we just think about the Christian world, in the early years of Christianity, all the way up to the Renaissance in the 15th century, I mean, the emphasis was on God. I mean, when they painted pictures and so on of biblical scenes, it was very clear that God was being disclosed here, that it was the one, the Creator was the one that was behind it. It was a theocentric world in a way, and the world all sort of fit together. It's often said in the medieval world the arts were all integrated. So you think of it was the age of the cathedrals, for example. So the cathedrals had this architecture, this Gothic architecture that's helped us to soar up to heaven, lifted our minds and hearts to God. The Gregorian chant was able to lift our hearts in the same way, gives us a sense of God's transcendence. The stained glass windows all worked together. The music of the time functioned in order to give us this integrated sense of who we were, where we fit in the world, and how we related to our God. And of course then with the Renaissance, now things changed. Now we became more anthropocentric in the world of art. So art began to say more about us than about God. And well, I mean, just to continue that history a little bit, when we get to the time of the Reformation, part of what the reformers were interested in was getting back to a pure immediacy of God's presence. So they weren't so happy with all these images and paintings and statues and so on in the church. They seemed to them to be cluttered and getting in the way, and they were favored a more immediate relationship to God, where you didn't need statues to help make that possible. And I mean, just to continue that on, I guess we got to a point eventually where it wasn't just man-centered art that led to God, but it was art for its own sake. I mean, art that had some other function. It was supposed to help improve society or something. And the terrible example of that would be the socialist realism that we talk about in Russia and in China. Socialist realism meant that you co-opted the artist to do what you wanted him to do, to help. It was a propaganda effort, what it really was. And even in Moscow now, you see some of the architecture or the statues that really give you that clear sense. Socialist realism, meaning let's glorify the working person and let's move forward the Communist Party ideals and so on. Well, what I'm suggesting is that there's sort of a history that brought us to this impasse that we're at now, where we are in this terrible subjectivism, and we're looking to see if the world of art can't help us. And I'm not just talking about intellectuals, but all human beings that need the world of art in order to draw us out and put us in touch with the one we call our God.
Yeah, it used to be, as you said earlier, especially in the medieval period, that painting and music and so on was specifically religious. But by the time you get to somebody like Vincent van Gogh, who's one of my favorite artists, and it was only recently that we remembered the 100th anniversary of his death, which was on July 29th of this year. Now, Van Gogh occasionally would do religious subjects. He did his Bible, I remember, and he did some of the parables, like the Good Samaritan was his favorite. But he says in his letters to his brother Theo that to paint the chair in his room, and to paint that with care, and to see the beauty in that being, that very ordinary thing, or to paint the peasants that he lived with in Belgium, or the postman toward the end of his life in Arles, and so on, that this was religious also.
I think it was Martin Heidegger, the philosopher, that was talking about Van Gogh's painting of the peasant's shoes, and said it was that painting in itself was filled with more deeper meaning than any religious painting he had ever seen. This was Heidegger, the existentialist philosopher, responding to Van Gogh's paintings. So all you're looking at in the canvas really are shoes of the peasants, worn out shoes and so on. But the suggestion being that is getting us in touch with the depths of the human condition, of life as it really is.
Well, it's also seeing the world as a sacrament, that everything is sacred, and that old distinction, some things are secular and some sacred, is not valid. that an ordinary person, a peasant, shoes, anything in life conceals God in some sense. There is the whole world is a sacrament.
Yes.
And Van Gogh would he started out as a minister preaching the word, and then when he went to painting, he really continued being a minister with a paintbrush. And in his letters, he spells that out. That God is hidden in ordinary life. The extraordinary is there if we have eyes of faith to see. And as an artist, that's what he wanted to do, to see beyond the mask, and to find the presence of God in the mundane.
I'm thinking, Roland, that for people, ordinary people, trying to look for some of this aesthetic experience, why would they want to do that? Well, one way is it lifts us out of ourselves, or it moves us away from a mere subjectivism, that it puts us in touch with something larger and bigger that can enrich us, that can expand our soul in a sense, so that we're not just running around in our own thoughts, not just thinking our own way, but the encounter with the work of art enables us to gain, I think, a larger perspective. And how are people going to do that? Well, I mean, as simple maybe as you suggested, through their gardening. I mean, to do that and to really create a garden that is refreshing and is an expression of their spirit, puts one in touch with some larger world. Here, I think, the sense of nature, and nature which reveals the great God. Or people who get inspired by music, maybe they have that same sense of being lifted out of themselves.
Yeah, I remember Thomas Berry, the author of The Dream of the Earth, has a section where he talks about gardening as a mystical activity, and that to have a small garden is a way of getting in touch with the deepest mysteries of the Creator and the universe. It's like Walt Whitman in Leaves of Grass. Well, even the very title would suggest that the most ordinary thing you can think of, grass that's everywhere, can take you to what is infinite and what is eternal, and that God is hidden there again, sacramentally.
I like your insistence on the word sacramental there, because I think that's what the artist brings out for us. Really helps to clarify all of that.
And even artists who are not realists, like the whole modern school of abstract expressionists, Mark Rothko comes to mind. We have some of his paintings in Toledo. These are not representations of a religious subject or any kind of subject. Matter of fact, Rothko deals with these huge areas of color, and he's really trying to see what the emotional connection is between the color that he puts on the canvas. And yet, that can become profoundly religious as an experience. I
think both you and I have been in the Houston in the Rothko Chapel, and I mean, it's awfully hard to describe, hard for me anyway. But I mean, there are no images on the paintings. I mean, when you're looking, you're seeing a whole wall of brown or shades of brown, large panels this way. Someone has suggested that abstract expressionism, as it's called, I guess we'd connect that with Rothko and who else? I forget.
Barnett Newman and a lot of moderns in that.
But anyway, those people, someone has suggested that it is very religious kind of painting because it leaves open the sense of mystery. It enables you to enter into it in whatever way that you seem to want to. Again, I don't think we're getting away from our point that it draws you out of the subjective. It allows a lot of room for you to think and for your own imagination and for you to supply. Supposedly, these great colors are supposed to be representing some deep emotions. I guess white seems to suggest hope and so on. Black, the tragedy side of life, and so on. But it opens up the possibility of you getting in touch with this larger mystery. You supply a lot, but it's still not just from within you. It's being in the chapel, and you and I both have said that it's a very prayerful place to be in. It draws you out and makes you feel you're in the sense of mystery.
Well, you participate in the artistic event. You have to give something to it and be creative. Of course, that's true of anything. If you have a great painting and nobody sees it, it's not going to communicate. But I remember I was in Houston about 5 years ago, and I went to that Rothko Chapel, and I didn't have much time, and I sort of rushed in and I looked around, and I was really puzzled. I said, I don't know why they're making such a big fuss over this. And then I had the opportunity about a year ago to go back, and there was something that was sort of nagging at me, And I said, I'm going to make time, and it was about an hour. It wasn't a lot of time, but it was enough. And I just went in that chapel, and I sat there. It's one of the most ascetic spaces I've ever been in. I mean, those paintings are devoid of anything that you would call realistic. And even color, it's almost washed out to pure white and maybe a little gray mixed in. But after a long time, I began to feel what Rothko must have been getting at, that it was truly spiritual. It was an ascetic kind of spirituality. It reminded me of Buddhism much more than Christianity, with all the richness, let's say, of the Catholic liturgy. This was very austere, but it was profoundly moving if you took the time to be with it and allow it to become part of your inner being. And very beautiful.
Yes, and it produces a prayerful experience, which I presume is one of the reasons for having the art, and I think he was commissioned to do that, to put these panels into this chapel, which isn't a very large chapel at all.
No.
I'm thinking, Roland, about this whole business of the subjective side of art and the problem of sentimentality. I remember hearing an interview with Andrew Wyeth, the American painter, on television, and his big thing was how hard he had to struggle to avoid sentimentality. And I think of how often we think of maybe art, saccharine, religious art, as being sentimental, of keeping us away from what Christ is really all about and putting us into some sort of dream world, an unreal world. I wonder if we could comment a little bit about saccharine religious art or the problem of sentimentality.
I guess I would contrast that with sentiment, which means feeling. And part of being human, and an absolutely essential part of it, is to have feeling, to respond to life, and to do so with different kinds of emotions at different times. But what sentimentality does is to take particular emotions and exploit them. And the writer, in the case of a play or novel, or the painter or filmmaker, whatever it is, really tries to overemphasize that thing. One of the examples that comes to mind that I would call sentimental, and I think a very bad film, is Love Stories some years ago. And it's about a young woman dying and a young couple, Ryan O'Neal, and I forget who the actress was, but they fall in love and she dies. That's essentially the plot. But it is set up to, I think, manipulative as any film I've ever seen, to make you cry, and it's very effective. I went with my mother in Louisville, Kentucky, I remember, and the whole theater was sobbing and hysterical, my mother included, and I just remember sitting there and being angry at the exploitation. I was definitely in the minority. But for me, it was just manipulation rather than a genuine probing of that relationship and of the whole question of grief. I remember a reviewer had a phrase that I rather liked. In reviewing Love Story, said that the whole purpose of this film is to give an enema to your tear ducts. And I've remembered that phrase all these years. That's what it was for, so you could cry. Now, I have nothing against crying, and I guess I don't even want to knock that film too much, but it's exploitative. I would not call that a great film.
You're trying to help us understand whatever this means to talk about sentimentality in art. And when we look at just pure religious art, do you want to comment on that at all? I mean, saccharine religious art?
Well, there it becomes even worse in a sense when you take religious subjects and present them in an exploitative way. In the Catholic culture, one of the examples that comes to mind are some of the Sacred Heart representations. They are so gaudy. They're ugly, really. I mean, they're repulsive. Jesus comes across in many of those pictures that I've seen on holy cards, not as a human being, but it's just a gross misrepresentation. And
does your same thing go there, that you see the artist manipulating you to?
Yeah, very definitely. And you know where that happened in a film recently that I rather admired, but this one scene was truly horrible. The Last Temptation of Christ, which was so controversial, and it was condemned by a lot of people who didn't see it. But I went and saw the film, and it was not a film that I truly liked, but it was thought-provoking, and it was a work of art. But in one scene, the director of the film, who was raised as a Catholic, Martin Scorsese. And in New York, I can just see in his Italian home there probably were pictures of the Sacred Heart, because in one scene he has Jesus talking to his disciples, and then suddenly, without warning, he just reaches under his outer garment, and he pulls out his heart with the ventricles hanging there and blood pouring out. I found it so repulsive that I almost had to leave. And I'm sure he had a good intention there, but the result for me was it was really gross. It was exploitative, and it becomes a cheapening of human emotion rather than something that
and I guess what we're
it.
suggesting, Roland, is that authentic religious art, whether it has a religious subject or not, or a secular subject like Van Gogh's painting of the shoes of the peasant, will do something else for us, that it lifts us out in some way, or puts us in touch with some larger mystery, and creates a really authentic emotional reaction. Isn't that what we're looking for?
Yeah, it makes connections. It seems to me that the whole religious life is to make connections with God and other people and self, and art ought to help us do that.
Okay, Roland, we've been talking about the spiritual life and the role that art can play in it, and we've been saying that one of our problems in our culture is subjectivism, turning in on ourselves, and that art in a way ought to lift us out of that, put us in touch with a larger reality, and that this can happen not just in terms of the opera or elitist culture, but can happen in simple ways, in preparing a good meal and in gardening and caring for the home and enjoying popular arts and so on, and that all of that has value. It enriches our spiritual life because it eventually puts us in touch with the mystery that we call God.